Hello, this is Kim McAllister, and this is Epidemiology Part 2. I believe I have the sound working. If you still are having issues with the sound, please let me know. I've run a test on my equipment and it all seems to be working okay now. So epidemiology, as we've already talked about in Part 1, is the cornerstone of public health. And today we're going to talk about the basic measures of morbidity, which is illness or disease, and mortality, which is death. There are a whole host of different measures that we use. We're going to talk about the most critical, the most important, to give you an idea of how this works. If you encounter issues beyond these particular types of rates and proportions, understand that there are ways of calculating more information than what we're going to go over here. And if you're interested in learning about that, let me know and I can direct you to some additional resources for that. We're going to discuss proportions, a variety of rates, and also talk about risk. Proportions are ratios with a denominator that includes the numerator. So when we talk about a proportion, we're looking at a segment of a population. So that segment of the population is the numerator, and the total population that that segment came from is the denominator. And a proportion, it just talks about numbers. It does not discuss a period of time. So it's just looking at a set of information without any mention of time. And this will make sense when we talk about the different rates in just a moment. So an example would be that there are 305 children in the third grade of a school district. Of those 305 children, 37 have asthma. So the proportion of children who have asthma in the school district would be reflected as 37 over 305. And then you would divide 57 by 305 and have 0.19. Then you can multiply that by 100, and the proportion of children with asthma in the school district would be 19%. Proportions always range from 0 to 1, and you see our proportion here is 0.19. To express it in a percent, as we did here with the 19%, you would multiply by 100. The percentages make it easier for people to kind of wrap their head around it. Rates are ratios that are used to make comparisons and interpret raw data. Now, rates are not a proportion, because our rates are going to be talking about time. And rates are the measure of frequency of a health event in a population at a certain point in time. When we talk about rates, we talk about a numerator, which is the number of health events in a specified period. It could be an illness, it could be an exposure to some type of toxin or other type of issue. And then the denominator would be the population in the same area in the same specified period. So after we determine that, then we multiply it by K, which stands for constant, such as 100,000. In this way, when we are comparing rates from, let's say, the rate of flu in 2016 in Kerr County, we can compare it to Bandera County and Bexar County or Real County because we use the same constant, 100,000. And then we can look at the different rates and they make sense. In other words, we can look at it and easily tell that this rate compares in such a way to that rate. Maybe we had 5% more than another county, and so on. This way the rates are standardized so that we know and can easily compare them. An incidence rate is the occurrence of new cases of a disease or a condition in a community over a period of time. So these are looking at the new cases. And this is relative to the population at risk for that disease or condition for the same period of time. So with an incident rate, you have the number of new cases divided by the population at risk. Then you multiply it by our constant K, and you will get the incident rate. So by looking at the incidence rate, you can determine the rate, kind of an estimate of the rate of risk for the population over a period of time. An attack rate is a special kind of incident rate. This is used if a group is exposed to a certain type of exposure. For example, if we go back to our example in the first set of slides, we discussed people who went to a picnic and became ill after eating egg salad. So our attack rate would be the number of people who were exposed over the number of people who became ill. And the attack rate may stay the same, it may go up, it may go down, but it gives us important clues as to the health of the population. Is this condition getting worse? Are we getting this condition under control? Have we identified all the people who have an illness? The attack rate helps us to understand that. Now, the most useful data that we gather about an illness are the prevalence rate. And the prevalence rate is the number of old and new cases, all the people that are already sick plus the people who just became sick, or all the people who were exposed plus the people who just became exposed. And we look at all of that at one time. And so we put the number of persons with the disease, the existing cases, and the new cases over the total population at the same point in time. And then we multiply it by our constant K. Prevalence is very important for people with chronic diseases. So because they look at all the people who have the disease at a particular time, they tell us a lot about illnesses that begin and then have a long duration. For illnesses that are going to come and go or that have a very high mortality rate, then the incidence rate is more important because the disease won't last over a long period of time. It's important to understand that incidence is people who are developing the disease, the new cases. Prevalence is the people that have the disease. That may help you remember the difference between the two. Mortality rates are important to understand because they tell us the frequency or the occurrence of death in a defined population over a defined period of time. There are different types of mortality rates, such as infant mortality, birth mortality, death, and then, of course, death by cardiovascular disease or death by cerebrovascular disease, death by cancer. There are some limitations in mortality rates because sometimes people will have one particular disease. Let's say they have diabetes, but they actually die from a heart attack, or they may develop cancer. Some other condition may cause their death. They could die in a car accident. So it's important to understand that mortality rates give us some idea of why people die and what the most common causes of death are. But the actual cause of death is not always attributed to the disease that we're tracking. Now, the next question that I have on here says, which mortality rate provides an overall indicator of a community's health? The infant mortality rate is the biggest indicator, the one that we track the most, that tells us the health of a population. The United States is in a unique position. We have, for those who have access to it, we have unbelievable health care in this country. We have medications and treatments and state-of-the-art equipment and screening tools and hospitals and so forth. We have um, all of these tools and personnel and resources that are not available in other countries. And yet we have the lowest success rate with infants. We have the highest infant mortality rate of developed countries. Let me say that again. We have the highest infant mortality rate among developed countries. There are a multitude of reasons for that. You can look at the fact that there are people who don't have access to health care. We have high teen pregnancy rates. Often teenagers do not get prenatal care or don't get prenatal care until late in the pregnancy. We have people that come here from other countries that may not have access to health care. We also have people who are living in poverty who do not have access to health care. The population in the United States who has the highest infant mortality rate are African American women. And interestingly enough, it does not matter what socioeconomic group the African American women are in. Even women who are in a higher income bracket have great health care, have all of the best that they can, the best that any of us in this country can have, still have a high infant mortality rate. And this is something that has been tracked for many years now. And we have found that people of minority races in this country do not always get the same level of health care as the majority races in this country. They do not always have access to the same treatment. They have performed retrospective studies and looked at the way people were treated according to race and according to income level and all these other factors. So it's very important when you're taking care of a patient of a minority race to ensure that they are getting the services and the help that they need. We have to make a more concerted effort as healthcare professionals and take better care of all of our patients. But all of our babies need to be given a good and healthy start in life, and we need to do more about that. And that's something that we are working on in public health. So why are age-specific rates helpful from a public health standpoint? Let's talk about adjusted and specific rates. Adjusted rates are rates that are more or less fictional. The adjusted rates look at what the rate would be if the population under study had the same age divisions as the general population. So they're taking the age ranges from the general population number and then processing the different rates as though that was the population for that specific group. So it may be age adjusted for preschoolers, or age adjusted for school children, or age adjusted for seniors. So understand this is an artificial number because the actual population of the group that's being studied is not the same as the general population. And you may be wondering, why in the world would we do that? Which is a good question. Well, the reason that in the world that we do that is because sometimes we need to make comparisons that we can't make otherwise. So this gives us a better snapshot of where things should be or where things are. And it's very important when you use these rates to notate this is an age-adjusted rate, or this is a adjusted rate according to gender. It can be adjusted according to various things. A specific rate is an actual rate. So a specific rate is looking at the actual preschoolers in the study population, not the general population. So again, it's important whether it's adjusted or specific that you clearly state in your tables that this is age adjusted or specific. Otherwise, the numbers can be skewed and the wrong conclusions can be drawn. Regardless, when you're doing these rates, you're going to look at the number of cases in a specific age category in population at a specified time over the standard population in the same age category at the same specified time. This is how you would calculate a specific rate. And you're going to multiply by your constant, which is usually 100,000. So let's talk for a moment about advantages and disadvantages of crude, specific, and adjusted rates. Your crude rate is the actual rate or count of, how many are sick out of the population. So the advantages are that it's readily available and they can be easily calculated. They're widely used even though there are some issues, but understand that you need to always note if this is a crude rate or what type of rate it is. The disadvantage is that populations can vary a great deal in ages. It may be that a certain population is disproportionately affected by a disease or by an illness or some type of health event, and so that's not always shown in a crude rate. In the specific rates, we have homogeneous subgroups. Remember, these are actual divided groups in the population under study. And so they're very useful to break them down because they help us find the population that is most effective. The problem is that it takes a long time to calculate all of this out. And so if you're just trying to compare a couple of subgroups, when you divide everything out by every single possible group, then that takes a lot of time and is kind of a burden on when you're just looking at a couple of groups. Adjusted rates, these are summary statements and the differences in the population are removed. As we said, we kind of use the standard of the normal population and apply it to our study population. And so it's not entirely accurate. So these are fictional rates and the magnitude depends on the standard population that was chosen. So if you picked a standard population that was completely different from your population under study, then your adjusted rates are not going to be applicable and you'll have problems with your data. And so the other thing that you can't always find is the different trends in the subgroups because you have artificially created sizes of those subgroups. And so it may look like the problem is bigger than it is or smaller than it is. So it's always important to keep that in mind and know your rates. So the three main ideas from our discussion are what are proportions and what are rates. And we discussed different types of rates and the common rates. So know what they are and know when you use them and know how to use them. In other words, how to do the calculation. And then define what the commonly used rates are. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and that this is helpful to you in your practice. And when we work on the demographic assessment, you'll have some actual numbers and you'll be looking at different rates of different diseases. And I think that will help this kind of fall into place for you.